Hey gang. Okay, so this is the first in the several boring videos that I told you I would do as a review. So I'm going to briefly go over a few of the topics from the first, was it now, week and a half-ish of class? 2 weeks of class? Doesn't matter. I'm looking at the American Political Landscape PowerPoint, Why Government PowerPoint, and Founding a Nation. And I'm just going to hit some highlights and spend most of the time on the Why Government and the Social Contract, since in a couple days you have a paper to write on that. But starting with the current political landscape, a couple of important concepts from that lecture is the difference between bias and partisanship. Bias, I'm using that as a synonym for also like your paradigm, worldview, the model of the world that you have. Your model of the world will have predictive powers. Not like a psychic, but the idea is to make it concrete, we should enact this policy because the world works like this, so that will happen. So we should enact healthcare or health insurance reform that completely removes government from the health insurance market and makes all health insurance, a private market matter. Because the world works in a way where if we have private markets competing with each other, private companies competing with each other over customers and resources, that will produce the best outcomes. So the theory is, free markets can, and competition will provide better outcomes in the health insurance area. And you would have a free market sort of bias to the world, and you would see things through that lens. So when you're looking at policy, your predictive power for that policy is going to go through that lens, and you're going to say, if we allow free market to work and we allow a completely deregulated private companies competing with each other for customers, that will lead to good health insurance outcomes, to lower prices, better access for everybody, things like that. That's part of how bias works. And partisanship is if you're a Democrat or Republican, and the degree to which you sort of root for, or support the Democrats or Republicans, even regardless of if you think they are wrong or not, basically. So we have two major parties in the country, Democrats and Republicans, as I've been saying. Democrats are considered the liberal party or the left party, the party of the left. Republicans are considered the right-wing party, the party of the right meaning on the right side of a political spectrum. And they're also considered the conservatives in the American political system. When we think about candidates and parties, we generally think about it as a single line segment, where if you're on the left, you're a Democrat, and there are certain things that more liberal people support. And if you're on the right of the line segment, you're a Republican, and there's certain things that conservatives support. So a right person, a right-wing person is a conservative, a left-wing person, someone on the left is a liberal, and Democrat on the left, Republican on the right. That's kind of, the shorthand for that stuff. Look through the slides on that American political landscape at what the the divisions, I think, between the Democrats and Republicans are pretty self-explanatory. And that should hopefully be that. So what is government social contract? This is going to be most important for your paper, so let's look at that. So we have government to provide services to people, to provide protection for people, to organize our economy, to create social rules that we will all abide by. Government provides the framework from which we interact in society. Our government is founded on the social contract. The social contract was developed originally by Thomas Hobbes. Thomas Hobbes is the father of the social contract. One of the things that's very important about the social contract is that it offered a secular justification for government. Before this, people would obviously say sometimes, I am the king of y'all because I get to be the king of y'all, and that's it. But in general, at least in Europe, king derived their power, justified their authority based upon divine right. Thomas Hobbes comes along. He's a monarchist. He believes that there should be kings and absolute rulers and things like that. But he says the God reason isn't a very good reason, isn't a good justification as to why somebody should be the ruler. So we need to have a new framework through which we decide who gets to be the ruler over us, or how we justify the ruler. So Thomas Hobbes comes through and offers a secular justification for government. And hold on one second. Okay, I'm back. You did not know I was gone because I just hit the stop button and then hit the play button or the record button again. So, anyway, Thomas Hobbes delivers a secular reason for government. He says the social contract, here's the theoretical basis of the social contract. He says first, humans existed in a state of nature. The state of nature is a dog-eat-dog world. It's a world also of perfect freedom. Now this is something where we can find freedom to be a bad thing, which often we don't think of freedom as being a bad thing. The state of nature is where human beings have perfect freedom. What perfect freedom means is there is literally no rules, no restrictions on what you can do. And a state of perfect freedom is not a state that people want to live in, according to Thomas Hobbes. Because a state of perfect freedom means that you can do whatever you want, as the extreme example I gave in class, kill your neighbor, take their stuff, and nobody can do anything about it. No protection, no punishment, nothing at all. Thomas Hobbes says in the state of nature there's no reason why you should trust anybody else. He calls the state of nature solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, and it's a literal place. And being a dead old white racist dude, he was like, see, look, those Native Americans over there. I don't know what he would have actually called them. I don't think savages. Anyway, doesn't really matter. He would say, look, they live in the state of nature. They don't have any government or any rules. That's dumb. So he had that justification, or he had that idea that it was a literal place, and he was able to point to where it was a literal place. So the state of nature is terrible. And because humans don't want to live in the state of nature, we voluntarily give up some of our rights, our perfect freedom, to what he would call sovereign. We could think of as a king, in Thomas Hobbes' case, a king, dictator, tyrant, benevolent ruler of all, where essentially that king would provide protection for us, provide rules for social engagement, but we give up all rights to the king, if that makes sense. So in exchange for protection, we say, hey, you get to create all the rules and laws that govern our society. But in order to do that, you have to make sure my neighbor doesn't kill me and take my stuff. That's how Thomas Hobbes saw the social contract. Next, we have John Locke, and we talked about how John Locke was the most influential of the social contract theorists on the American sort of founders and the Constitution stuff. Thomas Jefferson, who wrote the Declaration of Independence, called the Declaration of Independence pure Locke. John Locke went along with Thomas Hobbes in most things, except Locke added/changed the idea of what rights people could give up when they entered into a social contract and left the state of nature. John Locke said that there were some rights that were inalienable to people that they can never ever exchange for protection or give up to the sovereign. So there's some things that some rights, some freedoms people have no matter what. Okay? Thomas Hobbes felt like you would be giving up every single one of your freedoms and rights, but you would gain social order and protection. John Locke says you can give up most of your rights, but there's some things you cannot give up. Let's say, for example, free speech. I don't know if John Locke would have specifically said free speech, honestly, but let's say it's free speech, because that's easy to deal with. Now, John Locke comes along and says, also, if the ruler, the person you give power to in the social contract, starts violating your rights of free speech, then you can overthrow that ruler. Now, I said I don't know if John Locke would have had free speech as part of his argument, but he definitely would have had things like right to property, right to sort of have control over your own labor, really a lot of right to private property. He was kind of a small R Republican, not a member of the Republican Party, but a Republican in a government sense. John Locke was, but not quite in the way the founders were. Yeah. He's 100 years before the founders. Anyway. So John Locke's big addition is the fact that there are some rights that can never be given up to the ruler, to the sovereign, to the president, king, whatever, and that the people could overthrow that king. So you still enter into a social contract, you come from the state of nature. That's the way that works. Look at the Constitution is a piece of our American social contract. There's the Constitution, which is part of our social contract. We also have some, like unwritten rules, social contracts, or some parts of our society that have been sort of developed that we would identify as part of the social contract. For example, every child deserves an education. I think most people would agree that that's part of the that would be part of our social contract, a guarantee of our social contract, the thing that we have agreed upon among people that others deserve, that we can give up to other people. Just one example. There are lots of different versions of the social contract, from pure monarchy, kingship, to very decentralized communes type things. And I give sarcastic examples of that on one of the slides. But important for your paper, going from Hobbes, Locke to John Rawls. John Rawls has this idea of fairness, and fairness is very important to him. Fairness includes things like equal opportunity, the ability for everybody to have full participation in society, regardless of their, who they are, abilities or disabilities, things like that, what he called like the lottery of birth. And the way he developed what a proper social contract should be is he has two concepts, calls it, it's a thought experiment, and there are two concepts within this. One's concept is the original position. It's very important, original position. The other is the veil of ignorance. So John Rawls asks you right now, imagine that you are a soul floating above the earth. He doesn't literally say this, but this is a way to think about it that makes a lot of sense, and it's easier, I think, to understand. You're a soul floating above the earth. That's the original position. You look down at the earth. You see people going about their lives. There are rich people, there's poor people. You see how society is currently structured. You see that we have a long history of racism and sexism, and some of that stuff is ingrained in society, and we're still working today to, fix some of that stuff. You know that there are people who have handicaps or people who have different abilities. And so you're in that original position. Society has all these different people in it. Okay? However, you also have a veil of ignorance. The veil of ignorance clouds your ability to see who you actually are in society. Okay? So think of it as, part of what I said before. He's trying to, in some ways, combat the lottery of birth. Some people are born with certain advantages, and there is unequal opportunity in society. Some people have more opportunity than others, and he wants to try and level that playing field so that everybody has a chance to be all they can be. However, we're in this original position. We see how society is, but we don't know who we are in that society. We don't know which one of those people we are. We don't know we're these souls. When we're done creating our social contract, we don't know which body we'll be sucked into because of the veil of ignorance. Okay? So he says it's from that thought experiment that we should think of what the social contract should be. That's the only good way or the right way to do it. Because he points out the state of nature doesn't really exist. Nobody has ever really existed in the state of nature. Even as the human species evolved, we were still in some type of hierarchical society, or we had some sort of social contract. I mean, all great apes have some type of social contract, and great apes are like gorillas, chimpanzees, bonobos, baboons. There might be another one that I can't remember. But great apes, and we are also a great ape. Grape, sorry. All great apes have some sort of social contract because they have some sort of society, some rules of engagement that people within a community adhere to. So So chimpanzees are not in a state of nature. They also have a social contract, and they have a social contract they're born into, just like humans, except humans have a much more elaborate system. So it doesn't make sense for us to think of the social contract as something that we can voluntarily enter into. And that's why John Rawls says the right way to think of how we want to best organize society, how we want to best create a social contract, is to imagine that we are in a position where we know society has already been constructed, because we can't unconstruct and then reconstruct society. We know society's been constructed. We know certain things exist in society. But in order to carry this thought experiment to get to a just social contract, we have to pretend that we don't know who we are in that society. And we don't know what sort of hardships that we'll be faced with, or what sort of benefits we'll be faced with. Sort of benefits we'll have. And when you do that, you get a just social contract, which he calls justice as fairness, which involves, as I said, equal opportunity, which when you boil that down to then get these general values to specific policy positions, which is one thing I really want y'all to think about, how your values, you have, you maybe have these ideas that I support freedom, democracy, liberty, equality, but what do those things really mean to you? What is the real definition of freedom? Think of what it could mean in different situations and circumstances. And once you have that, then think about how those ideas of that you have, those values you hold to, your concept of a social contract, and what obligations or non-obligations we hold to each other, how those will translate into specific policy positions. Often we don't think about that connection, I feel like, and doing that is very important to become self-aware politically and to understand sort of where you are and if you're being consistent with your positions. And that's kind of where I want you to go at the end of the paper. So you'll want to look at or talk about Hobbes, Locke, and Rawls. Have a brief summary of each. Have them in that summary though talk to each other. So you might summarize Hobbes saying he's the father of the social contract, blah blah blah. Then you may say John Rawls comes along and builds upon Thomas Hobbes's idea. He's like, yeah, Thomas Hobbes is kind of right, but really there's some rights that you can't give up. So Thomas Hobbes is correct, but there's some rights that you can't give up. Then John Rawls comes along and says, this idea of the social contract is good, this secular basis of government, this idea that we come together voluntarily to create a society, as equals we come together to create a society and create rules and things like that. However, we're not equals in a lot of ways. We don't come together as equals. We don't start out as equals. We don't start out in this state of perfect freedom in the state of nature. So to conceptualize what a proper social contract would look like from the Hobbes and Locke way doesn't make sense to John Rawls. So he has this thought experiment of the original position in the veil of ignorance. So talk about those, then talk about a little bit of what your social contract would look like, and then I want you to take your social contract, the values that you espouse in that social contract, and create or talk about one specific policy position that you would support and why you get that specific policy position from the social contract. To education, everybody should we want everyone, I want everyone in society to have equal opportunity. That's a general notion that I have, a general value that I have. That's part of the social contract, that we all deserve to have the equal opportunity to make the best of ourselves. The way that translates into a specific position is that every single child should get a free, high-quality public education, and that we all have a responsibility to ensure our public schools are well-funded, that we help our teachers, that we give kids and schools the resources that they need, that we help fight poverty, which is the number one indicator of education attainment. I won't go off on a side note, but we need to do the things we need to do to create that equal opportunity, one of which would be to make sure kids aren't in poverty and to provide them a free education and a high quality education. So that's how you would translate that. 1 second again. And I'm back, and you probably didn't notice a thing again except for me saying that I'm back and me being in a different position. So that's the social contract. I have a list of key terms, ideas, review on the last slide of the why government review thing. John Locke taught, the advantages and disadvantages. Sorry, John Rawls, the advantages and disadvantages, the lottery of birth, and then state of nature, original position, things like that. So let's found a nation. The key concepts here. Well, let's set the scene. Christopher Columbus sails the ocean blue with Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. I think were the three ships, something like that. And he discovers America. Because nobody else was living here. It was completely uninhabited until white Europeans came over. So Columbus discovers America, and in 1960s we start having permanent English settlements and colonies develop. English colonies are different than Spanish colonies because English colonies are designed, or were designed at least, to be more self-sustaining. There's a greater sort of political system involved. There was a need to make sure there's a need to create a society similar to that in England, essentially, to make the American or the English settlements, English colonies work. In the Spanish colonies, those existed primarily in Central America, South America, and the Caribbean islands. There was a lot of sugar, gold mining, a lot of sugar, really. And they were run as super slave colonies, essentially. So the conditions in those colonies for slaves were extremely harsh. Lifespans were very short, and the Spanish kept having to import slaves because the slaves would die because of the way they worked them and to get sugar. Whereas in America, there wasn't a resource like that, a crop or a mineral or metal or something like that, that could be easily extracted under a sort of, condition of putting one or two people in charge and then having a bunch of slaves do work for you. There needed to be a broader economic system involved for the English colonies to work. And some people from England came over not just to find resources and economic reasons, but to establish new settlements because they were trying to escape whatever persecution they felt like they were experiencing back in England. We famously talk about religious persecution, for example. So the colonies are freeloading off the motherland for a while, and then the French and Indian War breaks out. So that's a war between the British/American colonies and the French and Allied and Indians that were allied with the French. We call it the French and Indian War now in America. When that happens, war costs money. And the British say, hey, we just spent all this money protecting you, American colonies. You've been getting a free lunch all this time. Why don't you start having to pay at least some for your defense? And America says, no. We've enjoyed the free ride we've had, and we don't want to pay you anything. So that creates some conflict. There were different factions in the American colonies. There was a loyal faction to the crown. Okay, there were the colonial elites. I'm listed on slide 4. Royalist Southern planters and merchants. Royalist people who were appointed by the king. Merchants, rich people that handled the exchange of goods and services goods, I guess, and materials into and out of the colonies. Think of them as like CEO business types, things like that. They were into imports and exports. And Southern planters, you got your rich white guy with a large plot of land and a lot of slaves. Colonial elites. And then you have those who are not rich, so those who are laborers making, blacksmiths, shoe makers, cobblers, candlestick makers, shopkeepers, that type of thing. And then you have small farmers, so lots of small subsistence farmers, things like that. As taxes comes down, it hurts not only the elites, but goods sort of increase in price because the elites want to pass the price of the tax on to the consumer, the poor people. So that helps create this revolutionary spirit. There are radicals in the colonists, quote-unquote radicals, who want to rebel against England. England makes some decisions which splits the colonial elite that was loyal to England, specifically more the merchants, away from the royalists and some of the southern planters. And with the merchant class then sort of coming in, we have enough people and money to tip the scales to support a revolution. Revolution happens. America writes the Declaration of Independence in 1776. War happens for a while after that, and then America's a free nation. Congratulations. Things escalated quickly. The Articles of Confederation was our first attempt at a government. It had strong state governments, no national executive branch, so there was no presidency. There was a national legislature. There's a Congress, okay? But it was a single body Congress. There was one representative from each state, and the national legislature could collect taxes, but it didn't have any way to enforce those things. It could say, Georgia, South Carolina, Maryland, not Mississippi, Massachusetts. That's what I was trying to say. We need $1 million and 30,000 troops because we need to defend the nation, or whatever reason. There was nothing in the Articles of Confederation that compelled the states to do what the legislature said. So mostly, the legislature was there, and it was essentially the states telling each other what they were doing. States in the Articles of Confederation were competing with each other, so Virginia may enact a tariff on goods coming from North Carolina to protect Virginia's manufacturing base. So if North Carolina wants to send a built chair to Virginia, North Carolina, the business person in North Carolina, when it crosses the border into Virginia, would have to pay a tax on that item, which would then make that item more expensive in Virginia than it would have been without the tax. That would benefit Virginia because they would get some tax money, and they would also be protecting their local manufacturing. North Carolina would be all sad about it, though. And that's not the way a country really, a cooperative country at least, acts with each other. States shouldn't be competing with each other. So the system's not working. We look like a laughingstock to everybody else in Europe. So we have this Constitutional Convention, which originally is there to reform the Articles of Confederation, but it's quickly seen that it needs to be scrapped, and we get the Constitution out of that. The two of the big compromises that you need to know about is a 3/5 compromise, which was the slave counting as 3/5 of a person compromise. So in the House of Representatives, the number of representatives you get in a state is based upon your population. Southern states wanted every single slave to be counted as a person so that they could have more representation. The northern states said, you're being dumb. The northern states eventually sort of forced this 3/5 compromise on the South. The South didn't want it. The South was being very pig-headed about this whole thing. But the 3/5 compromise, it was enough to make sure the South didn't leave the table, even though the South didn't really like it. It wasn't something they agreed to, but it was enough to keep them at the table, if that makes sense. The other one is the called the Great Compromise, also called the Connecticut Compromise. It's how our legislature, our Congress, became two houses, the Senate and the House of Representatives. The Virginia plan was to make the Congress, the legislative branch, based upon the representation in that, at least based upon the number of people in a state. The New Jersey plan was done to try and provide equal representation for each state in the Congress. So Virginia obviously said, we have more people, so we should have more representation in the legislature. Makes sense, right? Sort of follows that whole closer to like the one person, one vote type thing. New Jersey comes along and says that's not fair, because that means New Jersey, which was a less populous state at the time, would not have as many votes, and New Jersey should have the same amount of votes as Virginia. We can see here how this relates to the federalism discussion. The people in the American colonies at the time still viewed themselves as members of their colony, members of specific states, before they saw themselves as American. So the Great Compromise took the legislature and essentially said, okay, Virginia plan and New Jersey plan, we're implementing both of those. into the legislature, and those two bodies have to cooperate with each other. So we have the House of Representatives, which is the Virginia plan, which is based upon the number of people that live in your state, how many representatives there are from your state. And then we have the New Jersey plan, which is the Senate, which is based upon an equal number of votes per state, no matter how big the state is. And bills, before they can become laws, have to go through both the House and the Senate, or the Virginia plan and the New Jersey plan. So a very, very important part of all this is the idea that the founders, this is a key concept I want you to get, the founders were not a monolithic group of people, that there were bitter disagreements, lots of drunken cursing, fighting, as in literal fist fighting. Groundwork was laid at this convention for lifelong hatred and anger towards other people. There are some things in the Constitution that we can say probably a majority of the people that were at the convention did not actually support. However, 40% of the people supporting a plan is better than nothing, was kind of the idea. So you may have, think of it as like 4 different people are running for president. One person may get 35% of the vote, one person may get 25% of the vote, and then 2 people may get 15% of the vote. I think that adds up to 100%. That person who got 35% under our system, in most cases, would win. And the idea was for the founders kind of that doing something was preferable than doing nothing, that they couldn't leave and go back to the way things were. That change was better than no change. So if we have a plan that has a plurality support, which means it doesn't have a majority, but it's a plan that has support among most, has the most support of any plan, basically, but not a majority, so less than 50%, but it may have 45%. And all other plans have less than 45%. That would be a plurality. That was like, fine, we're not going to agree. This is going to be good enough. Let's do this plan that, even though most of us hate it, is the one that most of us can agree on, and let's just move forward because it's better than nothing. That was what was happening in the Constitutional Convention. So this concept that the founders agreed on everything, or even a majority of the founders agreed on something, very likely is not accurate. And if you hear a politician or a pundit say the founders believed X, the founders believed Y, they're not very well informed, or they're being disingenuous and lying to you. Because the same people that made the Constitution made the Articles of Confederation. Those are very different governing documents. And after the Constitutional Convention ended and we had the Constitution in hand and we had to vote on it, there were fierce debates between what were called the Federalist and the Anti-Federalist. Anti-Federalist being against the Constitution and Federalist in favor of the Constitution across the nation. And not every state ended up ratifying the Constitution. The rule that was established was 9 out of the 13 colonies / states had to agree to be in the Constitution. And the understanding was, even if, like, Delaware, for example, disagreed with the Constitution and didn't want to be a part of it, If every other state agreed with it, then Delaware would become part of it also. And we had a couple of states that said, no way, they refused to ratify the Constitution, but it was ratified by enough states and it went into effect, and those other states just fell into line. Eventually later they did ratify the Constitution, and every state has ratified the Constitution now, but for some states it was kind of like that whole Mississippi not saying slavery was bad until 1996. Mississippi fell into line, but they didn't, and the 13th Amendment applied to them, freeing slaves and making slavery illegal. But they didn't bother to say it was actually wrong until 1996, and they didn't end up ratifying it until 2013. Go Mississippi. So that's the key concept, the big key concept. The other one that I like to really harp on is the fact that God is not in the Constitution, because that's that's one of the big current political debates, that we're a Judeo-Christian nation, or that somehow our nation is founded on Christian values. It's possible that a majority of our founders weren't Christians in the way we would sort of think of Christianity today. A large number of them were deists, which meant they kind of believed in a God, but the God doesn't do much in the world. They may have been sort of marginally Christian by default, but they wouldn't think that they could pray and anything would happen. This was during the Enlightenment period, where people were looking for, secular reasons for the way the world works. The scientific method was developed with rational thought across the land. God was brought up a lot, at least several times, but it was always voted down. The Constitution explicitly says there will be no religious test for office. And in the Declaration of Independence, it does say all men are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among those the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The word Creator, God, Jesus, Judeo-Christian, which wasn't a term that existed, didn't exist or doesn't exist in the Constitution. So that's important. It may be an exam question. How many times is God mentioned in the Constitution? 0. Exam question? Maybe. I think that covers the big things I wanted to cover for this. We have the period of the amendments. I'll talk about that more in the federalism part, because I like to go over the periods of American sort of political government organization in the federalism piece. So the rest of the stuff hopefully is kind of self-explanatory, or you can look it up, ask about it in class. And that is that. So I hope you enjoyed, if anybody watched this. If you did, you got an exam answer. Hold on. Okay. How many times is God mentioned in the Constitution? 0. So, have a good day. Good night, whenever it is you're watching this. Enjoy your weekend. Whatever. Later.